Bueno, buenos días. Comienzo presentando la mesa. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas todas. Lamentamos este retraso que hemos tenido para empezar con las jornadas. Tengo en la mesa el subdirector Emilio Argente, subdirector de Urbanismo, la directora de la cátedra, Eva, está la subdirección de la cátedra por aquí con nosotros. Bienvenidos todos los interesados en este tema. Estamos encantados, la Escuela de Arquitectura está encantada siempre de recibir cualquiera de este tipo de jornadas que salen de la docencia reglada. Entendemos que la formación del arquitecto no solo es la docencia que tenemos durante las clases convencionales, sino que todas estas jornadas forman parte de la cultura y de la formación profesional del arquitecto. Debería estar acompañándonos, como os comentaba, el director general de Urbanismo. Por problemas de desplazamiento no ha podido llegar a tiempo. También el director de la escuela, don Iván Cabrera, ha estado con nosotros también para presentar esta jornada. También por otros compromisos de agenda no ha podido ya quedarse más con nosotros, así que voy a dar yo inicio a la jornada. Espero que sea muy fructífera y como llevamos un poco de retraso, voy a ir dando la palabra para este acto breve de presentación y que podamos empezar con lo serio, que es lo que va a venir a continuación. Por cierto, los que habéis visto el cartel, ANEM FEINA, para los que es un escrito, un texto en valenciano, que es algo así como nos ponemos a la obra, manos a la obra o vamos a trabajar. Así que, don Emilio.
Muchas gracias. Y lo primero es disculpar al director general. Me ha pedido que pida disculpas porque en principio estaba previsto que viniera. Por motivos del desplazamiento pues no ha podido venir. Ahora hablaré con él porque si puede vendrá, aunque sea a última hora, a cerrar o se incorpora en algún momento. Pero bueno, en principio era su intención venir y pido disculpas. Nos hemos retrasado, con lo cual tampoco voy a, como no estaba previsto que yo dijera estas palabras, yo me reservo para mi ponencia de después y así nos ponemos a la hora. Y bueno, destacar simplemente el interés de la Consellería por la cátedra de Género, de Urbanismo y Género con la que tenemos un convenio. Y bueno, esperamos que con las ideas que nos aportéis, pues nosotros seguimos trabajando con cambios normativos, con ideas. Ahora tenemos varios cambios normativos en el horizonte. Bueno, pues para mejorar en lo que nosotros somos administración, nos debemos al derecho urbanístico. Todas las ideas que se puedan plasmar aquí, esperamos también ideas prácticas de las ponencias que se van a dar hoy, del coloquio que hay al final. Bueno, pues un poco recoger todas esas ideas para ir mejorando. Y nada más, cuando queráis, pues pasamos a la primera ponencia.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Eva, en calidad de directora de la Cátedra de Urbanismo y Género. Eva.
Bueno, pues lo primero, buenos días. Lamentar el retraso, pero las cosas, justamente la perspectiva de género, lo que quiere decir es que la realidad es compleja y diversa, o sea que ninguna novedad. Agradecer a Emilio Argente, subdirector de Urbanismo, que esté aquí presente hoy, y a más miembros de la Consellería, y por supuesto Ernesto Fenollosa, que es director de estudios de la escuela, que está, digamos, representando también a Iván Cabrera. Como saben, esta cátedra es un convenio entre la Generalitat y la UPV y su objetivo es la ciudad inclusiva y cuidadora, es decir, la incorporación de la perspectiva de género. Y nosotros lo único que queríamos decir hoy es que hemos actualizado la página web, que entren y que la miren, que pueden descargar la guía de género tanto en valenciano, en castellano como en inglés, que hay un canal YouTube donde están ya subidos todos los vídeos de los distintos eventos que hemos hecho, la ANEM FEINA, el Congreso y ahora unas píldoras, de las que hablaremos, y que hemos añadido ya aquí un blog donde se descargarán las publicaciones y los distintos eventos que vayamos subiendo. Si vamos al canal de YouTube, quiero adelantar, es todavía en beta, la primera píldora para explicar la perspectiva de género. A ver si se escucha, mide 1,40.
personas involucradas en el proceso de planificación y actuación urbana. Esta guía se estructura en 4 partes. La primera sobre qué es la perspectiva de género, la segunda sobre los contenidos, la tercera sobre los documentos y la cuarta sobre el proceso. ¿Qué entendemos por perspectiva de género? La perspectiva de género reconoce que todas las personas somos seres humanos únicos afectados por diversas circunstancias, con sexo, edad, capacidades, etnia, etc., que no deberían generar discriminación. Sin embargo, estas circunstancias a menudo influyen en nuestras vidas cotidianas. El rol de género es una construcción sociocultural que asigna diferentes responsabilidades a hombres y mujeres, resultando en una desigualdad estructural que afecta de forma negativa principalmente a las mujeres. ¿Por qué es necesaria la perspectiva de género en actuaciones urbanas? El entorno construido refleja los valores y objetivos de la sociedad que lo crea. Tradicionalmente, estos valores han favorecido el mundo productivo, generalmente masculino, y desatendido las tareas de cuidado, mayoritariamente realizadas por mujeres. La incorporación de la perspectiva de género en el entorno habitable enfoca su actuación hacia el desarrollo de una ciudad cuidadora y de proximidad. Recuerda que puedes descargar la guía tanto en valenciano, castellano o inglés desde nuestro sitio web urbangenere.upv.es.
Bueno, esta es la primera píldora de 4 que contarán, digamos, los básicos de lo que se está haciendo en la cátedra y que se promueve a través de la guía. Todo eso está accesible, de momento es un beta, estamos en una primicia, y también queremos decir que las actas del Congreso del año que viene estarán disponibles ya en la red en una semana y un poco más, porque ya están en la editorial. Sin más, paso a presentar a Judit KIMPIAN, que, digamos, si quieren, bueno, va a conectarse con nosotros, habla un inglés muy británico, muy perfecto, tenemos algo de traducción simultánea para quien lo necesite y se va a grabar. Teníamos por ahí debajo unos rótulos en castellano, pero salían un poco raros porque los estaba leyendo y no tenía mucho que ver con lo que estaba diciendo y nos restaban imagen. Si alguien tiene algún problema, pues nada, puede preguntar después o ya lo veremos. Judit KIMPIAN es una experta en sostenibilidad. Una de las líneas de la guía por las cuales se incorpora la perspectiva de género es el cuidado del planeta, del resto de los seres y, por supuesto, de todas las personas. No podemos cuidarnos a nosotros sin cuidar el lugar en el que estamos. Luego, la sostenibilidad, desde el punto de vista, desde luego, de Carlos y mío, que no lo he dicho, Carlos es su director de la cátedra, incorpora la perspectiva de género, la sostenibilidad. Y hemos empezado por esta línea hoy y hemos invitado a gente que está trabajando sobre cómo llevar a la práctica las cuestiones que tienen que ver con la sostenibilidad. Judit KIMPIAN es, digamos, la responsable de toda esta investigación en el Consejo de Arquitectos de Europa y está muy vinculada al RIBA, que es el Instituto de los Arquitectos Británicos, también para la incorporación de la sostenibilidad y, por supuesto, de la perspectiva de género. Sin más, querida Judit, te dejo con nuestro auditorio, que es todo amigos, estudiantes y profesorado. Gracias. Cuando quiera, when you want, you can begin.
I just have to unmute myself. Can you hear me now? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eva, for the invitation to participate in your wonderful event. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be remotely in the room with you today. It's really an honor to be invited to give my thoughts on the gender perspective, especially in the context of climate change mitigation. I have to say, it's not going to be a scientific talk. There are many more experts on this topic in the room who will be more qualified to do that, in particular on the gender aspects of sustainable construction, but I will try and give it my best. Eva mentioned I have lots of hats. I teach at UCL, I work at the Architects Council of Europe, I represent the Royal Institute of British Architects at the governance board of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. I work on a Net Zero Cities program. I work in policy and design in net zero. But what I hope to share with you today, what's led me to champion the gender perspective in the various forums that I'm involved with, and how this is relevant to my day-to-day work. So I started as an aspiring young architect looking at changing the world with quick fixes, as we like to do, creating spaces that are ephemeral, if you're familiar with the word transient, are easy to erect and dismantle. So my PhD was titled Pneumatic Architecture in the Digital World, and it was a project-based PhD at the Royal College of Art. And yeah. So while I was researching my PhD, I also worked freelance, putting my hard-earned digital skills into use to design and also manufacture sort of event architecture, exactly the spaces that I was researching to do. And at the end of the 1990s, you could say the architectural community was absolutely seduced by curved form. It was the first time we had the structural and the digital tools to imagine and control and build these things. And I was absolutely fascinated as well with how the brain is fine-tuned to detect any changes in curvature. And why is our brain so seduced by big curves? And of course, it relates to, how biological issues. So for example, the brain is very finely tuned to detect very minor changes of curvature and detect these, and also to attach meaning to them. And you can imagine why that is so important. Just interestingly, symmetry and asymmetry. So a lot of biological structures are symmetrical, especially the higher organized ones. And so the brain attaches an immediate sense of a living object to anything that's symmetrical. So in architecture, when we do use curved buildings, we often try and veer away from that. Not in this case. When I worked at Foster & Partners after finishing my PhD and the R&D group, I worked on many projects, but this was one of my favorites, because manufacturing curved form became really a possibility with digital tools. And as a team member in advanced modeling, I was also simultaneously leading the implementation of basic solar and environmental analysis into the practice workflow. And I had the privilege to work on this building from its very inception. So you'll see the initial computer model and then how we generated the physical model from that. And well, 2 decades later, it is a profound expression of how we are not necessarily designing for a static world, and that we really have to plan ahead for that. So guess what's causing the patterning on the building on the right-hand side? The building was covered in shingles, and of course the solar radiation over time causes the graying of the shingles. But on the other side, you can just see where the solar radiation doesn't hit the direct solar radiation doesn't hit the building anymore. Apparently, Norman loves the look, but it's certainly not something that anyone anticipated. So how do we plan for imagining buildings in an environment that is not static? So my next step in terms of my career, it still remained with the manufacturing of curved form. I was working on this project called Dubai Metro when I became head of advanced modeling at AHR. I was in charge of the digital design and engineering coordination of 24 Dubai Metro stations. And you can talk about, again, the animation of these projects. Every single one of these stations was different. And so I got quite hooked on controlling these differences through digital models, which allowed me to get design decisions approved and executed, got away with a 30-meter cantilever, which, yeah, just you can see some of the changes in the model shape as the building animated through its development. And of course, there's nothing like standing on the top of that 30-meter cantilever and checking in the 40 degrees if the curvature was correct. But it was a wonderful project to work on because we were able to create an absolutely positive icon. It was a daring project, and it was, it was quite difficult to get away with this form and adapt it to the different situations. And it was a public project for public transport in a country that only had individual forms of transport until then. And then I started working with my colleague Abdulmajid Karanu, who actually now lives in Dubai. And I worked with him on Dubai Metro, and he went on to lead the design of the Al Bar Towers in Abu Dhabi, which includes actual moving structures. And designing this building was kind of the culmination of our exploration into animated structures. And then I noticed I always ended up being either part of the sole woman in with 3 people, 30 people in the room, 300, or in this case on site with 3,000. I wanted to also point out how much precision-led process there was leading up to this, and the control. I keep coming back to this word of control, because it's not just a personal issue, but what we can control, we can build. And so you will see how much of this modeling was done to communicate the building's form and its performance and its details. And all of this animation happened during the design stage. So while we're often talking about designing for an animated symbiotic relationship with nature, we also forget that most of the animation, in terms of the fast animation in a building's life, happens during design and construction. And we can now use these digital tools to simulate design, construction, and operation. And not only that, but also to simulate design feedback. So to plan ahead for this transformation and interaction over time. Just some pictures of my last visit. And so have a look at all these different models, and we think of them as avatars or digital twins to calculate and visualize and to communicate all these different properties of buildings. But despite all that, I learned with these projects, sorry, my cat's photobombing the talk, as she always does. The absurdity of working on tall sculpted towers under the regeneration label took its toll on me. And I was really relieved to win the opportunity to work on another project, which was the Masdar Mis neighborhood, where I was able to put into practice the technical skill I gained for a much more human scale development. This was the first net zero district then in the world, a hugely influential project in the Middle East, trying to find a way to transition from a fossil fuel enabled world to net zero. We worked with these models to develop alternatives for optimizing the performance. In this case, we had to be sure that we can generate the amount of power we needed to run these run these buildings. This is the energy consumption on the bottom bar, and this is the amount we're generating. But not only that, we could kind of change the configuration of the building. We could change how much energy we use from different sources, changing the building fabric, and therefore use this same technique to argue for better design. And what you can see here is all of these different plots, the visual for them, and the calculated energy consumption versus the amount of power we are generating. And on the right-hand side, you can see the embodied carbon impact of the building, which had to be within this limit. It was the first time I had to do this kind of balancing, and there were iterations after iterations after iterations, and we were dealing with 8 plots. And it was really a fascinating and innovative process. But you might wonder what all this has got to do with gender and architectural design, which together seem to be the elephant in the room. Well, so in architectural design, we're always balancing conflicting drivers during design, during construction, and also during operation, which we tend to forget about. and what we and how we do that balancing, not just the tools we use, but also how we communicate the various implications of those decisions is really critical. And it's really important that when we think of the gender perspective, I think this way of negotiating projects is extremely important. And we are in an absolute crisis around Europe, but also around the world in terms of housing. I wanted to mention the role of indicators. So it's a really good way of seeing why we are in such a crisis. If you look at median home price to income ratio, it's just in the UK and the US and in Bulgaria, it has over the past 20 odd years, prices have increased by from the 4 times to 8 times. So they have more than doubled. And I don't need to talk to you about the climate crisis, but we have incredible temperature rises causing really quite unbearable heating in cities and homes. And the frequency of unpredictable weather brings flooding, as you can see in this recent picture in Budapest. But as you know, there are lots of tragic events associated with that around Europe. And at the same time, to survive as a species, we should really prevent waste and biodiversity loss, which also jeopardizes, so puts into danger our food security. It increases overheating. So, for example, where you have lots of planting, the temperatures underneath the foliage could be between 5 to 15 degrees lower. And of course, nature is the ultimate carbon capture route. So we have to be able to do better. And I've come to realize that it's more often than not, women are leading this transformation, and it's amazing when men are doing the same. But this is quite a challenging journey, and there are lots of hoops to jump through. And so I was thinking, what are the mechanisms in design and policy making that can help us? So my background is in counting carbon. And again, you might wonder, how is this relevant? But let me show you. So when we think about operational carbon, water consumption, and embodied carbon, we're talking about the resources that we use to create something with those resources, which is usually comfort and well-being, climate change resilience, and to create value, social, economic. And we want to do this at a relatively low cost, and especially low whole life cost. And we want to do this over a building's lifespan, from product to construction to use to end of life, and also beyond life. So how we then reuse these. Because we spend something like 90% of time in buildings these days, and absolutely most of us 100% in the built environment. Absolutely counting carbon across the lifespan of buildings helps us design for the way in which people use buildings. And I will try and give you a few examples. So counting energy, tracking energy use really helps us discover what works. Energy is effectively counting effort. The more architecture is doing its job, the less effort a building needs to exert to keep its occupants comfortable and healthy and productive. And ultimately, effort equals energy use. And in the EU, as you know, 40% of emissions relate to energy use in the building sector. So despite large-scale decarbonization of the grid, we have really not managed to reduce energy consumption much in buildings over the past decades. Not only that, but in this graph, you will see in the UK, we did this study where we created this online platform so people could log what they anticipate they are going to be using in terms of energy, which is the blue graphs, and then these are the measured performance. And as you see, the measured performance tends to be sadly much higher than what we anticipate. So together with my colleagues, we secured funding and persuaded lots of stakeholders to enter the design. And then this kind of created a massive momentum and allowed the government to start a new research stream to try and close this gap between anticipated and achieved performance. And these are some of the buildings that I was leading the study for, and the insights were fascinating. Look at this building, for example. So these are the energy bars, the energy consumption kind of outputs, annual energy consumption, kilowatt hours per meter square per year for each building. And as you can see, the top bar is what is measured for each building, and the bottom is the calculated. So what are the causes of all these gaps? So if we just look at one school, we found that complex systems present a big risk to construction quality. I don't know how many architects in the room would understand how building management systems, BMS, building management systems, work. But usually what happens is you have temperature triggers and carbon dioxide level triggers that measure air quality, and automated openings are set based on what values you reach. In this case, they forgot to commission the temperature values, so the temperature triggers, so the windows were open really wide in the winter a lot and were absolutely shut in the summer. So there was no cross ventilation. As it turns out, counting energy also helps expose other quality issues in buildings too. So if you take a look at this door, it seemed like detective work at the time, but we really wondered why this building was using so much energy in the winter for heating. Well, this door has a little latch here, and it came with a £1.50 or €1.50 Allen key to withdraw the latch, so that because it's a security door, it closes all by itself. But if you withdraw that latch, people can use it to circulate. But the building manager didn't know this, so he kept it open all the time. And as a result, a gale, a wild wind was blowing through all of the ground floor all year round. So no wonder that the building could not heat without much, much more energy. Which made me think of how many of these interface design issues between buildings and people we get wrong as an industry, and how can we think more about our end users instead of the sterile photos featured in magazines. And this is where we began to have our conversations with Eva, where I think we have a similar interest in the end users of our buildings. And the methodologies that we use to map the users of these end users. This is a graph of an occupant satisfaction survey result in the buildings I have just shown. In a well-designed building that otherwise meets occupants' expectations, energy use can step up to overcome basic thermal comfort issues. As you can see, this is the building, and most of the signs in terms of health and design and image are all green. So the extra energy consumption managed to cover up those issues. These are the titles. And when you, but interestingly, this type of feedback can offer other insights too. So take these two academies. They were very close to one another. They had similar climates. We were measuring the heating, so the thermal, the temperatures and the CO2 levels, so air quality within these two buildings. This building had all of these meters green, and this one had all of them red. Strangely enough, the measurements were almost exactly the same. The difference was, check out this, people are very happy with the design and how it meets their occupants' needs. In this building, they're not. They tried to create this open plan teaching, which was an absolute acoustic nightmare for the occupants. And what we often find if the building doesn't meet the occupants' needs in one area a lot, then that tends to affect people's appreciation of everything else, even if the empirical measurements for those are the same. So know that the fact that the building didn't work for the occupants made them feel that the air quality was not good, their comfort levels were poor, and the temperatures were uncomfortable, even though these were the same. So I think I just really want to highlight that one of the things that I would like to revisit about these studies is that in these statistical surveys, we really rarely drill down to look for clues about satisfaction of different subgroups, different genders, different ethnic backgrounds, neurodiversity. These are people who tend to be in minority, and their responses are therefore often not taken into account in these large statistical surveys. And this is something I would very much like to promote in the future, and I'm trying to work with other people who are interested in this area to advance this at European level too. So watch this space. One other thing about the gender perspective. So I tend to look at things in terms of how long they're going to work, hopefully how little effort I have to put into keeping it working, and how little funds I have to put in to keep it working. A very common mistake in construction is not to take into account thermal bridging. Thermal breaks are tricky to build, especially into an undulating tower like this. But it's a really good example. It's quite a well-known example for the extent to which you end up heating the outside, but also the amount of damage that thermal bridging can cause to indoor air quality through mold, and it can, in some cases, damage the structural integrity of buildings. I didn't really want to mention Grenfell Tower today, but one of the things that this kind of thermal control and way of controlling quality should be transformative in preventing accidents and due to poor construction quality. And I know in Spain there's been a recent tragedy similar to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. So controlling quality and so controlling the thermal comfort, controlling the construction quality for that, controlling the energy consumption are really good clues in avoiding such construction issues. And so we really place a very big emphasis on verification of operational energy consumption in the UK, and these are some of the standards. I wanted to show a few examples from this. These examples come from my book. This is a UK passive house project designed by called Carrabrack Meadow by Hampson Baron Smith. The building was, people often argue that designing these buildings are far too expensive. It had a cost of €1,800 per meter square. This is at the very low end of home construction, I think, in particular social housing in the UK. All of the following projects targeted operational performance, which means in-use consumption figures. These are measured after a year of a building being up and running. So Keynsham Civic Centre is a project I worked on quite a lot. It's a public building which targeted an operational rating, which means an energy in use from the start. And we managed to reduce the client's energy bill the council's energy bill by a whopping 96%. And the occupant feedback from this building, also from both genders, which I'm very proud of, is consistently positive. Another project, AHMM's offices, on this particular retrofit projects, the practice also did really extensive occupant satisfaction surveys, which contributed to raised occupant satisfaction too. Like sometimes showing an interest when designers show an interest in the building, it triggers positive feedback from users too. But what this study also helped identify was how occupants interact with the building fabric, which in this case was really crucial to the building's healthy and energy efficient working. For example, we find that people, when the building reaches 26%, 26 degrees, occupants just open the windows regardless of what they're told, because they just want to feel the air movement on their skin. Important point when designing passive cooling and ventilation in a building. When we carried out the post-occupancy evaluation on the Everyman Theatre, so Hayworth Tompkins, the architects, learned really a lot about the resilience of building finishes. But also, if you look at this plenum ventilation, it's a passive system that pre-cools or preheats the air coming into the auditorium of the theatre, which was a risky design move, but it is working really spectacularly well. And this building, being the Rocky Mountains Institute headquarters, is also built to Passive House standards. Note how the building, we really like illustrating the strategies with these cutaway sections so that you can get an understanding not just of how the building interacts with the environment, but how how people's activities in the building relate to that. And yeah, Archetypes Enterprise Center, it doesn't just meet Passive House limit, but it's also one of the lowest carbon footprint buildings in the UK. So it's got one of the lowest carbon, embodied carbon figures. And what we learned from this project is that we absolutely need more inspiring, beautiful buildings with data that shows that these buildings really work. Now, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but do tell me to finish when you do. But I wanted to talk a little bit about materials as well, and their impact. There are two new books out, which are both amazing. One is my fellow author, Hattie Hardman, and friend Joe Jack Williams, on materials, environmental primer, and Duncan Baker Brown on the Reuse Atlas, which again has lots of case studies. But what you will see when we're talking about the material impact is we begin to talk about the life cycle stages. I showed before the product, the construction, the operation of buildings. This is the official graph for this. And well, what does counting embodied carbon do for building quality and users? Well, it means cradle to get grave. Most of the building's carbon footprint is in the manufacturing of products, but it is also in the maintenance and the reuse and recycle phase. When we start counting embodied carbon, we start looking at the kind of materials we use, how well they last, how often we have to replace them, and how easy is it to access and maintain the different building parts, which is a really healthy way of looking at buildings. So again, a few quick examples for you. This is the winner of the UK Sterling Prizes in 2019, showing that buildings like this can be built. This is an example of social housing in the UK, built to Passive House standards, and extensive post-occupancy evaluation carried out on it. Building was built for €2,000 per square meters, and its long-term energy and maintenance bills are extremely low, and so it's below the 15 kilowatt hours per meter Passive House limit. It was also built with a really low carbon footprint. It is possible to build high-quality social housing at a manageable cost. Unfortunately, in the UK, because we have this strange right to buy system, some tenants have the right to buy these buildings. So it means that we have a very low social housing stock in the UK. Another building with similar embodied carbon and similar operational carbon impact is called Lichberg-Backe by Van Kunsen Architects. It's a co-housing CLT project completed in 2018 with we're thinking about new housing models, which buildings have shared. This particular building has extensive shared communal areas to reduce the cost on the per meter square cost for the whole building. Another project, Spearfield in Berlin by Fat Golan Architect, a self-built passive house project. And so I wanted to just flag to you the wider framework that we're trying to implement in Europe called the EU Levels Framework for Sustainable Buildings. It looks at greenhouse gas emissions, material impacts, water consumption, the resources that I showed you with the images before, and also what we try and achieve with them in terms of indoor environmental quality, climate change resilience, and cost and value. What's really good about them, this framework, is it gives you the metrics of what to monitor. But we absolutely mustn't forget the qualitative sort of metrics, the qualitative indicators for empowering architects and built environment specialists, built environment professionals to build high quality architecture. And this is the Baukultur Davos 8 criteria. The professionals behind this movement were really keen to find the metrics and standards to promote high quality architecture in public procurement, in energy legislation, to really provide policymakers with the right hooks to enable this to happen. And Baukultur, I wanted to highlight how it talks about the gender perspective, gender equitable places, inclusion for all, human rights and safety, and mix of users and connecting people. I really recommend having a look yourselves on the Baukultur Davos 8 link. And not to forget that this kind of quality system underpins the new European Bauhaus movement and value systems. So co-design and participatory processes, as well as the shared, safe public realm, are central to these movements. Very quick about climate change resilience, designing for extreme weather events such as heat and wind and precipitation, and so extreme rain events and flooding. We're trying to simulate building performance with future weather data to look at overheating mitigation and plan. And this is one of the most important points for the gender perspective, is to plan for likely occupancy patterns and behavior, changing family structures, different roles in households, and how those pan. For example, taking my mother-in-law in to look after herself. I needed a bit to look after her for a while when she broke her leg. We needed an extra room in our house, and to be able to do that, or to be able to transform the spatial configuration was really helpful. Just a quick one about indoor environmental quality, how different people experience all of these indicators differently, and how we can plan for that. And just to remind you that this levels framework is really now underpinning all of these EU mechanisms, and that it's one of the only frameworks that has a strategy for briefing, for design stage, for procurement stage, and for use, and to communicate lessons learned so that we can improve. We have a short time to improve. Just very quickly, designing for feedback. So this whole idea about feedback loop, improving and quickening our innovation cycles, we do need feedback. What's worked really well? What's helped improve the productivity, the attendance rates in schools and in buildings? How can we reduce staff sick days? what's helping property values. And I'll show you a few examples. So this particular one, also I wanted to say that we call them soft because they're often really hard to evidence, and causality, or the why, is even harder. The evidence is even harder to establish. But setting soft aims should be part of every planning strategy and project brief. And these kinds of surveys really help capture architectural design, creating direct value. In the case of this project, by Arkitema Architects in Denmark, this is a new psychiatric clinic where they managed to reduce forced fixation of patients by almost 70% and medication by 60%. In this school by Art Architects, also Danish, the number of students increased by 25%, who then achieved a 40% rise in exam completion results. And in this glue lamp skateboarding shed by Van Kunsen Architects, they managed to reduce life cycle cost by 80% compared to a conventional sports hall. So I highly recommend reading Linnea Espersen and Peter Andreas' free-to-download book on this. This is where these particular case studies come from. And while I'm not sure how to formulate the indicators for gender inclusion, I would be very happy to hear your thoughts on this. And for example, we always discuss with Eva having gender-balanced jury members for awards and competitions is really absolute basic, as well as planning decisions. This would be a really good start. For now, I will leave you with the brilliant news that our work on the UK's net zero carbon building standard is coming to fruition. We have just launched a pilot for the standard last week. This will be the first UK standard that will set out a way of really robustly proving that a building is net zero carbon, and that it is in line with the UK's carbon target. So what we have as a carbon budget for the UK and what we do as architects has to come together in the middle. So some very, very bright and motivated young people have managed to create these limits, and we have now launched these. You're free to sign up on the website, and yeah, don't hesitate to take another look at my book, which you can purchase from the RIBA bookshop or Amazon. That's describing the principles that I have just been discussing. And you're also welcome to listen to the podcast by Hattie Hartman. She runs the AJ Climate Champions series. You will hear from many others who are working on creating a more equitable built environment that works and works for all. Thank you. Any questions?
Hi, Judith. I was suffering because I find your lecture so intriguing and so exciting every time I hear, but it was a bit too long for the students today. And I think
I'm so sorry.
Maybe, do you have any question for her? I have many questions for you, but I think I will talk to you directly.
We can talk
another day. If they make any question to me in class, or I will forward that to you in another moment. Thank you so much for your...
Sorry to take so much of your time, and I leave you to the day, and have a wonderful conference, and I can't wait to catch up.
Every time I hear you, I listen to you, I find your work extremely important, because you insist in the difference between performance theoretically and in the real use of people using the work of the buildings. So thank you so much. We will talk soon.
Thank you again for having me and for all your patience.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.